then Nick, if you want to go over the protocols.
Yeah. So hi, everybody. For these Zoom webinars, we are doing them in this open format, not the formal webinar style. So we require everybody to use their well-accumulated Zoom know-how to turn your cameras off, to mute your audio. And if we do during the question and answer end up getting to some kind of speaking component, remember to re-mute after you speak. If anybody's joining via phone, you can press *6 on your phone to mute. If it doesn't have a mute button, many phones do have their mute buttons. You all know the controls for Zoom are at the bottom of your screen. Throughout the presentations, if you have a question, you can type your questions in the chat window and they'll be read out loud during the Q&A session after our guests have finished their presentations. That's going to be our primary mode of translating your questions. If you need help, you can raise your hand or do a private message directly to me, and I will do my best to assist you. This presentation will be recorded. It'll be available on the IARC website and on the YouTube channel. We'll be sure to share with everybody those links after it's over. So with that all said, I'll pass it off to Cecilia for the introduction and to welcome our speakers.
All right, hello everybody. So first, we'll start with land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Alaska Native Nations upon whose unceded traditional lands we are located. The UAF campus is located on the Troth-Yetta, a sacred site of the Lower Tanana Dene people. We acknowledge and honor the ancestral and present land stewardship and place-based knowledge of the peoples of these territories. Thank you all so much for joining us during this last week of the semester and week of virtual AGU. We know that you're all very busy, and so we really appreciate your attendance and participation in the discussion today. Our topic is discussing how our approach to research is changing with co-production of knowledge and competitive collaboration. The traditional research model has been criticized for separating science from society, leading to the need of more usable science for decision-making, while also drawing on the experiences and expertise from a diverse group of participants. Creating more usable science definitely has its challenges, and we are excited to discuss some of them and the outcomes with our panelists. So our first speaker today is Dr. Jessica Black. Dr. Black is Gwich'in Dene from Fort Yukon in Nenana, Alaska. She obtained her bachelor's degree in social work from UAF and her master's and PhD in social work from Washington University in St. Louis. Her dissertation focuses on the relationship between Alaska Native governance and well-being, especially as it pertains to natural resources management. Dr. Black co-leads several research projects that examine the importance of salmon to Alaska Native peoples and communities, as well as how Alaska Native voices are incorporated into decisions around salmon and other natural resources governance. Our next speaker today is Dr. Uma Bhatt. Dr. Bhatt is a professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in the Department of Atmospheric Science. She is the Associate Director of the NOAA Cooperative Institute for Climate, Ocean, and Ecosystem Studies. She earned a BSc in Mechanical Engineering and a BA in Russian language from the University of Pittsburgh. She served as a US Peace Corps volunteer teacher in Kenya, where she became interested in climate because of the severe East African drought of 1984 to 1985. She earned a master's and a PhD in atmospheric and oceanic sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and did her postdoctoral research in atmosphere ocean climate modeling at the Center for Ocean Land Atmosphere Studies. Her current research interests include climate drivers of tundra vegetation change, seasonal forecast skill of sea ice and fire weather in the Arctic, and co-production of research that has relevance for stakeholders. And with that, we will start with Dr. Jessica Black. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Gwinzi. Good afternoon, everybody. Shojri Jessica Oji Gwachaje Gwatsan Ihli Gatanangwichi. Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Black, and I am from Fort Yukon, Gwachaje, and I live here in Fairbanks. I work at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in the Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development, and also Tribal Management. I did create just a few short slides. Mainly, I'll just be talking with you all today. So I think I have, no, maybe, let's see. Okay.
You should now try again.
Okay. All right. Sorry, it's just taking me a minute. I don't know why it's being this way. Sometimes on Zoom it. Okay, there we go. So first of all, I want to start by doing a land acknowledgement myself. I live and reside on the traditional homelands of the China Hultani, the Lower Tanana Dene, and it is my great honor and privilege to be working here and living here on lands stewarded by Indigenous people for the past 10,000 years. This map right here is just basically a language map from the Alaska Native Language Center. And I just love this map because it really shows the depth of diversity in Alaska Native languages and people while recognizing Indigenous people here in this state. I am fortunate that I was able to return home to UAF after getting my PhD to live and work here, and I feel like that's a great honor. My family comes from up in the northeast corner of the state, the Gwich'in territory of Fort Yukon, and we spanned over into Canada, although there's a border there. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a Danaut woman. Indigenous knowledge and upbringing has fundamentally shaped my worldview. As stated, I have my background in social work, and my dissertation really looked at the relationship between Indigenous governance and well-being, especially as it pertained to natural resource management. At the time I was collecting data, there was a moratorium on salmon fishing in the upper Yukon River, actually all through the watershed. And that really had significant impacts on my people and also people up and down the river who relied on salmon for not only their subsistence livelihood, but also social, cultural, and spiritual well-being. So that dissertation work really is my grounding platform. And from that, I've really broadened my research to include cultural protective factors and justice and equity centered work. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Indigenous methodologies are really at the center of my work. This is just a list of some of my projects. I know we only have 10 minutes, so if you're interested in learning any more about these or me and my engagement in this work, I'd be happy to chat with you at a different time. What I will say is that I've partnered closely with Dr. Courtney Carruthers. We started working together a little over 5 years ago. We had a project titled Indigenizing Salmon Management in Alaska. And it was funded by the Moore Foundation and a program called Salmon Connect. And we were looking at Indigenous knowledge systems around salmon management, also ways in which the current management systems could be improved, and how to better collaborate and bring together Indigenous knowledge and also Western science. That original funding source ended, and we applied for an NSF grant that got funded, and we're continuing that work. And as you can see, a lot of the work has just grown from there. I'd like to always start by saying that there's 3 sovereigns in Alaska: Alaska Native tribes, the federal government, and the state government. And I think that's really important because as sovereign tribes, they are unique governments. So, we enter, as tribes, we enter into government consultation with the Bureau of Land Management, with US Fish and Wildlife Service, with Health and Human Services. So it's really important as researchers that we understand that tribes aren't stakeholders, that they're sovereigns, and they have a unique government to government relationship with the US federal government. And that goes all the way back based on federal Indian law. This picture on the slide, I want to recognize some of my mentors and Shiro's, Dr. Charlene Stern on the left, if you're looking at the picture, Sarah James, longtime advocate and Netsai tribal member, worked to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for the last 40 plus years, and then her niece Tanya Garnett, who's also a longtime advocate. And these women are just incredible. They've really pushed forth advocating for this sovereign government to government relationship. And I also work a lot with Charlene in the area of research, as she's also a faculty member here at UAF. So co-production of knowledge approach brings together different knowledge systems while building equitable and collaborative partnerships from different ways of knowing. I really love this quote from Daniels and Behe, because it really looks at these knowledge systems as their own intact knowledge systems in their own right, not one subsumed underneath the other. And so just a little context, what I've found is that much of the research that engages with Indigenous people today is done in a way that's very extractive. The knowledge is treated as data that researchers aggregate, not its own intact knowledge system. And also many researchers refer to Indigenous knowledge holders and tribal communities as stakeholders, and not recognizing the tribes as the sovereign governments that they are, which is why I always have a slide on sovereignty. A first step then in meaningfully co-producing knowledge is to recognize that sovereignty in the communities we work with. In Alaska, there's over 200 federally recognized tribes. So when other researchers approach me and they want to work with communities, I always refer them to the tribal government to have a conversation and talk about their research ideas to see if it's needed, warranted, if the tribes want to collaborate with them, not only in the generation of research ideas, but the implementation and evaluation as well. So from start to end, that there is a meaningful relationship that exists where each person or each community researcher, each sovereign is coming to the table and engaging in these meaningful conversations around the research, the implementation, and the evaluation. And that's really important because some communities, some tribes, I'll use the word tribes because we're talking about sovereign governments, but when you meet with some tribal governments and their community members or tribal members attend the meetings around research, there may be a need for the research that's being implemented, or there may not be, and there may be genuine research fatigue that exists. We've seen in the last 10, 20, 30 years, a lot of money being pumped into the Arctic to study different phenomena. And we've gotten better about engaging communities, but we're not there yet. A lot of times that money is brought in, tribes are consulted on the later end of things, and that's where a lot of the problems arise. A linear step in meaningful co-production of knowledge is recognizing Indigenous knowledge as its own intact knowledge system. Again, a lot of the conversations I have are well-meaning people who really struggle with this concept of Indigenous knowledge. They want it to be something that they can measure the way they're used to measuring things, or they want me to have a very specific definition for them to understand. But what I'll say is, Indigenous knowledge is very adaptive. It's an adaptive knowledge system based on several factors: a long-time relationship with the land, transmission of knowledge through generations, interaction with the land, observation, if you want to say experiment of just being on the land for so long, you're witnessing and seeing changes over time. I remember my grandfather, he passed away, but he would talk to us about just how the river was changing so much. And true, over a period of 10 plus years, the river just completely changed directions and took our whole entire fish camp out. Now, he had been talking about these things for a long time, but he wasn't like writing them down, documenting them for something that could be seen with the eye, but he was talking about that with us as his grandchildren, his children, but also his friends who are out on the river as well. And so I have this how to start co-produce, how to start to co-produce. Learn about the history of Alaska and the places where research is suggested, conducted. That's the other thing is I found just as an Indigenous person of this place is, and a researcher, people will ask me about, questions that I'm happy to answer, but I also very much encourage them to learn the history of Alaska. There's a deep history that exists here. And specifically with our Native communities, each community has its own unique history. And all of that matters when conducting research. There may have been good relationships with researchers in the past or not, or there's a growing, developing relationship. I learned from one of my other projects of researchers doing work in a similar place that I was interested in. So, that was useful to know so I could talk to them and see how we could maybe collaborate, or if in this case, I needed to just bow out because there was enough being done. These are the things that are really important. Build and strengthen the relationships necessary to ethically and meaningfully engage Western and Indigenous scientists fully in the collaborative research process. I think over time, this can only be done with time spent with people and community and understanding those things like history or current research efforts or Arctic change, how hunters, I was on a call a few days ago and a hunter was sharing with me just how much things have changed for him with, climate change and also particularly melting ice and warming temperatures and not seeing the animals that usually are there in his community and how much that's changed the rhythm of the community. Because yes, there's these seasons or laws that dictate when we hunt and fish as Native people, but there's also seasons in which we're out on the land. And so spending time with people, spending time in community, in collaboration to holistically understand these things can go a really long ways into developing strong long-term relationships that can produce better science, quite frankly. And then developing a mutually respectful process for co-creating questions, conceptual models. And this can be frustrating, I think, for some researchers because they're used to like pumping out a proposal and really working on these deadlines, and it requires a longer period of time to develop these things in collaboration with community, but it's the best way, in my opinion, to do things. And that's truly, I think, the way forward, because otherwise it can be really hard to get the formal approval or develop a sound relationship if people aren't involved at the front of these proposals and these idea generation. Follow up, I always say that because my own elders always shared with me that, you can't just do research and not follow up. They expressed to me when I was doing my own research how many times that had happened to them in the community and how frustrating that was because they had given so much of their oral histories, their stories, their data, like moose data or ice, changing ice conditions, and then they just back, and that was really hard. And then providing space for mutual learning through the inclusion and mentorship of Indigenous youth as the next generation of scientists and community leaders. And then just the last slide, nurture, build relationships. If we really want to take this a step further, support Indigenous-led research. There's a growing cohort of Indigenous scholars across the UAF system who have deep connections to their community and place. And if we can support more of that to develop strong research ties and also give back to community and honor the knowledge that is inherent there in community in place. Support Indigenous students to, learn the best of Western science and Indigenous knowledge. They're bringing their Indigenous knowledge so we can have the best research methods, data collection, and outcomes. And then advance equity initiatives at the university. I say that because when I first started, there was a lot of resistance to even talking about Indigenous knowledge or talking about racism or things that I, as an Indigenous woman, experienced that really I had to work through to get, to the place of engaging in my own research proposals. And so if we create equity, not equality, but equity, there's more opportunities for diversity in these research programs, proposals, that type of thing. And then elevate Indigenous knowledge as its own intact knowledge system, not tucked under any other knowledge system, but in its own right. Support tribal initiatives. Some of the research that I've talked with communities and brought to tribal governments to discuss weren't necessarily things that tribes wanted to work with universities on, but maybe on, they wanted to lead these research initiatives. And that, that was good for me to know, because I think for some of our tribes, it's hard, or our communities, to engage with the university because it is a big bureaucratic system and there's a lot of paperwork involved, and then just things move fast and there's the time to build relationships. So it can be really difficult. And so I just, when I'm talking with tribes and that's where they're at, I support that. And then just keep educating yourself. So I think I'll stop there and turn it over to my counterpart. And I think there's time for questions and comments at the end. So thank you so much.
Great. Let me share my screen. Thanks, Jessica. That was great. I have a few slides that are mainly pictures, I promise. Anyway, so I'm going to just talk about things that have happened to me personally that have led me to this kind of world that I sit in, where I do a lot of collaborative research. Talk a little bit about my background, various places that I've been in, various projects, and I'll try to be quick because I think it's a bit long. And I think you already talked, Cece already mentioned my Peace Corps experience, which was really an important experience in my life because I went from being an engineer to an atmospheric scientist. And these are some pictures, and this picture over here shows the view from our outhouse. So it was beautiful, and it really was close to nature, and it was just an amazing growing experience. It changed my, there. So I received my PhD in atmospheric sciences, and I wasn't quite done yet. And my husband finished early, and my advisor moved to the University of Washington. So I ended up finishing the last 2 years of my PhD from my rural house in Tennessee, and this is what it looked like. And it was really hard to be isolated from other graduate students. And my husband had a busy job, so he's gone a lot. So I was alone for a lot of the time. And I think there were times where it was really hard to be a graduate student. And I know I've talked to some of the students about this. And I sort of, as I prepared this, I thought maybe this also prepared me for the pandemic. Like, how do you work on your own? And there was internet in the early 90s. And some of these experiences where I really struggled, I think, were the times that I got clarity about what I wanted to do in the end. And one of the most important things that came out of that experience is I didn't want to do science by myself. I didn't want to be a lone researcher. I really wanted to do group team science and, sometimes leading and sometimes supporting. And this is sort of the journey I've been on for the last 25 years. I came to Fairbanks in 1998, and within 10 minutes of being in my office, an Indian researcher in the GI showed up and welcomed me. And I've lived a lot of places in the US, and I've never had that happen before, Indian as from India. And and I thought that was really, that really represented what a warm, collaborative place Fairbanks is, and Alaska. And here's some early pictures and version. And this is the IARC faculty and staff early 2002. And I see some of you who are in this picture from 18 years ago are in the audience today. And sorry, I lost my, sorry. I know as scientists, we often feel awkward talking about our feelings and about being human. But I think as we think about collaborative science and working as a team, you really need to treat the person as a whole. You need to kind of know what's going on and figure out what are the things that are causing struggles in each of us, because that's how we help each other do better science. And I'm going to tell a few stories about collaborations that have occurred over the years and how important they were. The Atmospheric Science Department sits on the 3rd floor of our building where the National Weather Service sits. And it's only one of a few places in the US where the Weather Service is co-located on the university campus. And just conversations you have on in the hallway are often those that lead to this collaborative science. And when Rick Toman was a forecaster in the Weather Service in the early to mid 2000s, my students would make plots. We do climate research, so it's a slightly longer time scale. And then we'd go meet with him. And I always told them, be really efficient, because he's a forecaster and he has tons of work to do, but he was really generous and he would give us feedback. And that ended up changing the science and the stories and led to co-authored publications. It wasn't, all the people who contributed were acknowledged. And I think that's very similar to things that Jessica brought up, just from a slightly different, from the perspective of how, scientists work together. And there was, I guess, another paper that Rick and the Weather Service folks really contributed to was Peter Bieniak's 2011 climate divisions paper. So this is a plot showing climate divisions of Alaska, and it turns out that they look amazingly a lot like the language divisions that Jessica showed. And Martha Shulsky, who worked at the Alaska Climate Research Center, said, we don't have official climate divisions in Alaska. And because we don't have these officially blessed divisions, we don't get a lot of products from NOAA. So to make a long story short, Peter ended up calculating these divisions, and there was a NOAA meeting, and one day all these forecasters from all over Alaska were poring over the map, and Peter's method was very mathematical and theoretical, using cluster analysis. And the weather forecasters with local knowledge said, well, you need to divide the panhandle into some more divisions. And we ended up doing that, but when we wrote the paper, it was, the reviewers didn't like our description of using expert knowledge to change the divisions from something that was very calculated. But in the end, we ended up justifying it to the reviewers by citing documents, publications about indigenous knowledge and local knowledge that had been used in Africa to change interpretations. So once we had that academic support, it was easier to get it published. So I think things have changed a lot in the last 10 years. So I don't think that would be a problem. And it was really important working together with a lot of the folks in the Weather Service to have the climate divisions blessed. The paper was that work was finished in 2011, or paper came out in 2012, and it was 3 more years where the late James Partain of NOAA Alaska had to spend a lot of time and effort to get them through the NOAA bureaucracy. And I think sometimes looking at it from the outside as a scientist, we had many, many telecons, and I was frustrated. I was like, why is this not moving faster? And then one day the climate divisions were suddenly blessed, and the next day NOAA rolled out all these products. And then it became clear to me that, oh, they were like building all these other things behind the scenes, and somehow I hadn't understood that. So I was frustrated when I shouldn't have been. So I think sometimes think about, there's other things going on behind the scenes that may be affecting or making things go slower, because I think in any collaborative work, things don't go quickly. You have to change your, lots of different pieces have to come together for it to work. I'll just give another quick example of something that I think is very collaborative is the Arctic Report Card. And they had their big press conference on Tuesday at AGU. The picture on the top shows the first Arctic report card, and it's certainly, and the one on the bottom shows the most recent, and it's certainly gotten a lot slicker, and it's really become much more inclusive and is explaining the full Arctic story. So it's really nice to see that evolution. I've also had the privilege of working with Dr. Ann Reardon, who's an anthropologist who's worked in the YK Delta for years. And probably 2009 or 10, she submitted a proposal to NSF and to document elder knowledge of climate change. And she was recommended by the program managers to get some climate scientists to join the project or to interact, be part of the project. And I was really fortunate to be recommended to be part of this because it's really been enriching for me and my students. And I think what's been really important, and some of these things that Jessica said, I'd like to really emphasize. So Anne holds these gatherings where her role is really to document the history of various aspects of things in the YK, and it's always driven by what the elders are interested in documenting at any given time. So it really is, driven by the local community. And she really sees herself as a facilitator, not as an academic in that sense. And since 2010, my students, Peter Bieniek and Amy Hendricks, and I have been going probably about once a year, maybe twice a year, sometimes to these meetings in Bethel. And at the first meeting, we showed some trends of the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which is the satellite measure of tundra vegetation productivity. And tundra vegetation all over the Arctic is greening. This index is going up, the biomass is getting bigger, except in the YK. And so we wanted to talk about what we had found, and we've been having these amazing conversations with the elders of what their thoughts were on what are the mechanisms, what do they see at the ground that may be causing this change in vegetation. And from our first meeting, one of the first striking things was they really felt that, snow and precipitation were important. So Peter and I went back, we spent some time, we analyzed snow and precipitation data, and then we went back the next year and showed what we had found. And so it's been 10 years now, and we go to these meetings and give updates and share information. And based on what we learn from our conversations, we kind of take this research further. And, we haven't published a paper specifically on these conversations, but I think we're getting there to get a better story on how to tell that. So again, as Jessica said, these things take time, and we have to really think about that. And I think what's really important here is, I would say Anne is the boundary spanner in this case. She's the anthropologist who knows both sides, the kind of academic university people and the local community. And that's, I think, really important. That's an important mechanism to help. And I think the tribal organizations are, I would think, are boundary spanners also. Another example that I have that is really user-inspired research is the fire forecasting that we've been doing. And I'll tell a bit of a story. In 2015, we were getting ready to write a NOAA proposal, and we had a bunch of Peter Bieniek, myself, some other researchers, and some Weather Service folks. And we were thinking of writing a proposal to forecast river ice breakup because it was something that we were curious about. We had done some work on it and we had some ideas, but it was more driven by our personal curiosity. And then Jean Petrescu, who's the lead of the Arctic Testbed, NOAA, said, why don't you look at forest fires? Because we had just had the fires of 2015, can you forecast them? And that was because he saw that as a need. Having those conversations kind of changed our path. We wrote a proposal. We joined up with the Alaska Fire Science Consortium, which is also a boundary organization. And that linked us to a lot of the fire managers, Robert Zeal, Sharon Alden, Heidi Strader. And that totally changed how that project was going to go. We wrote the initial NOAA proposal, and that was funded. And then, you know, again, the problem is hard because the stakeholders want a forecast in March of what's going to happen in the summer. And as a climate atmospheric scientist, that's a pretty big ask. But it's been great to work on this very challenging problem and see a real use for it. So it's one of the challenges, but it's also what makes it more interesting. And since then, we also got some more funding through the Alaska EPSCoR program to work on this. And we still have a few more years, so hopefully we will have some decent forecasts by the end. And again, in a lot of these interactions, certainly on the fire research, we meet bi-weekly with the team that's very interdisciplinary and the fire managers. And it's those regular conversations that help us get to doing science, that allow us to do science that ends up being useful. And I'll kind of end with my parting thoughts of what we need. You know, there's a lot of challenges here. I've given you this scattershot view of, you know, just some thoughts that I came up with, but I think you need to genuinely care for the long-term outcomes, and you need to check your ego at the door, because I think when you do collaborative science, it really goes against this typical typical model of how science is done. You know, you got to beat your competitor to the end, you know, the end game, no matter what it takes. And I think I always think of the Watson Crick story, how that's made into this drama, and they get all the credit when it really was a lot of other people that contributed. So I think we need to think about how to compete in a different way and how to facilitate cooperation. I think you really need to listen carefully and be patient for these kinds of things to work. You need to build strong relationships with people that you work with and your collaborators, and you do that by being reliable. And you also have to give credit for ideas. And I think sometimes that's really hard in science, that people are very, and I can think of it as being use the word extractive. People come and somebody gives you an idea and you quickly publish it. And that kind of really goes against us moving forward in this area. And I think we really have to build a framework that helps early career faculty succeed, because typically your promotion and tenure is really based on individual success. And when, you know, often you work in a team, maybe you don't lead author the paper, but you really gave a very important contribution and you had a leadership role, but you know, what is the definition of leadership? And that's really hard when you're early in your career and people want to see that you've led things before they, you know, give you tenure or promotion. And I guess I'll say, you know, in our so-called modern society, I think there's a lot to be learned from traditional cultures. And I can think of an example in Kenya. Our students, I taught math in a secondary school, our students sat in desks that were paired desks. And I remember when we were trained by the Peace Corps, they told us, you know, students will cheat off of each other during the math tests. And it was really hard to convince students, please don't cheat during the test, because in rural Kenya, people came from this culture of always helping your cohorts. And how do you teach them? Well, you're not helping them, because if you cheat on this exam, when you take the final exam that gets you into college, you won't be able to help each other. So again, I think working together is really important, and it's going to be even more important as we solve these hard problems for the future. Thank you so much, and hopefully I didn't babble too long.
Thank you both so much. So I know it looks like we have one question in the chat. If you guys have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you would like, and I will go ahead and ask this first one. Brendan Kelly has a question for Uma, and he says, you referred to producing useful, in quotation marks, research. I think I know what you mean, but wonder if you could say more about useful and not useful research.
I think all research is useful, so that's not fair. Something that can be used in the near future. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. I think all research doesn't have to go down this path of being useful for society. You have to have some fundamental research that people do, because that then eventually down the pipeline leads to more useful research. So we need the whole spectrum.
And Dr. Black, did you want to go ahead and mention your comment?
Oh, yeah, I just said for me, useful research benefits the collaborators or the communities you're working with, as well as yourself as a researcher. And I've had experiences where I really had to take a step back and rethink some of my own ideas because they weren't really useful or they needed to be amended. The communities wanted something different. And that's also where I had to take a step back and realize that I also needed to not have all of these ideas and, you know, just spring them on the community, but engage in collaborative idea and or question generation.
So I don't see any other questions coming through the chat just yet. One question I had for both of you is kind of, you both mentioned that it takes time to obviously develop and nurture these relationships. Have you seen or do you foresee things like project proposals and stuff allowing for more time in this, you know, there's this publish or perish mindset in academia. Do you think that things will kind of become a little bit more lax so that we can develop those relationships?
Jessica, do you want?
You can go ahead if you want.
Go ahead.
So I do see a shift in understanding. I have mainly NSF funded projects. I do work on one NIH project. I think consistent communication, and there was some of the meetings that happened at the beginning of the year with NSF and all of the PIs and navigating the new Arctic. A lot of these topics were brought up in the importance of time and also more collaborative research and what that meant. And so I think that it is slowly shifting. I mean, academia has such a long history, and so that competitiveness to pump out grants and publications and also you know, be recognized, I mean, that's deeply entrenched. So I think as we move towards more co-production of knowledge, or in what I suggest, you know, with Indigenous communities, Indigenous-led research, there needs to be a shift in some of that still, because it does take more time.
And I guess I would, yeah, I totally agree. And I would add that there are discussions on campus and on the campus DEI committee about, do we need to change the metrics that we use? And I guess one other thought that came up, I think this is my husband and I were having this conversation. He said we actually have to have a metric on the cooperativeness or the collaborativeness scale of any individual, because sometimes you go to meetings and these are often high-level meetings and people will often push their own self-interest. And how do you measure the ability of people to contribute, kind of thinking of the big picture? Like, so we need different metrics to better describe this change from, you know, competing, you know, dog eat dog, to working together.
And Christy Buffington has a question, but she said she can ask it in person.
Yeah, that's a longer conversation that I can have with you.
Dr. Black, thank you so much for sharing your concepts about sovereignty. I really appreciate that. And I teach a watershed management class for undergraduates as an adjunct faculty. And our textbook uses the word stakeholders. And I'm seriously thinking of like abandoning the textbook. But I could also point it out and use the word sovereign nations instead. And I also want to have many more examples of watershed management that are Indigenous led here in Alaska in this course. So my questions for you are for people teaching undergraduates, how can we make this change to have more equity and also give students the skills they need to be able to understand that people are sovereign and aren't just to be consulted, but truly, have the knowledge and can self-govern in management.
Yeah, I think it just speaks to a greater need. I mean, there's a lot of misconceptions about tribes in general, or not a lot of knowledge. In the last few years, there was a Alaska Native themed requirement course implemented at all 3 universities, UAS, UAA, and UAF. And those ANT courses do bring in some of this knowledge. So just that baseline understanding, but it's also important for new faculty moving here, because I think there's the assumption that if you work with someone or someone, you can collaborate. But I think what I'm saying is stakeholders, they usually, that word is meant for someone who has an interest in a topic or, a concern, or, and whereas a sovereign is a government. So when you go into communities to do research, you recognize that and present before the tribe to approve your research or not. I know that in some regions, like I think in the YK region, they actually have their own IRB through, is it AVCP? I'm not sure, but they have their own IRB, and then you work with the tribe. So what I had done in my own region is I worked with the nonprofit who oversaw research, and then they had me go meet with each individual tribe. And that was my recognition as the sovereign governments. They are not with just like a stake in what was happening, but they are the governing body. So I think just educating your students, but also, the textbooks and the writings, like if people aren't writing about it, then it's not shifting in the, like, as far as like the reading. So, for myself, it's making sure I'm able to write and update things as they happen. And there's been a lot of advancement in writing about Indigenous knowledge. And then I wanted to put a little plug in. Margaret Rudolph has a TED Talk series where they cover some of these issues or topics, and those are great resources for students to attend and learn from a diverse spectrum of scholars, and they're recorded too.
I have a question from Rich Collins to both of you, and he's asking, how can the university prepare scientists for co-production in terms of the kind of training they might need, or the changes in the curricula or internships?
Actually, I'll let you start that, Jessica, since you're working, you have a funded project on that.
Okay, so can you say that again? I'm looking in the chat and trying to keep up with all the questions.
I think he sent that one to me privately, okay. But what kind of, how can the university prepare scientists for the co-production?
Yeah, and so one thing I did put in my slides too is, and I just put a bullet, but bringing students along is really important, giving them the opportunities to engage in this type of work with you. I think Uma talked about bringing one of her students out, giving them opportunities to, directly engage in this type of research. A lot of my students are Indigenous students, and they bring with them a lot of knowledge already from their own upbringing. So creating spaces where that knowledge can be shared. So we have a grant called DAMUMTA. It's a National Science Foundation graduate research traineeship, Dr. Carruthers and I. And we wrote into the grant, it would not only fund Indigenous students for the next 5 years to get their degree in fisheries, but we would create different learning experiences on the land with elders, creating spaces for them to share their Indigenous knowledge with each other, but also faculty, staff, people interested in that. So I think building the next generation of scholars is really key. In the work I do, we have a lot of non-Indigenous students and allies also who are very interested in the work. So collaborating, we can't do everything. So relying on each other to do the good work, but also staying in communication so we can share what we're doing. We can attend these TED Talks or share a paper that really speaks to these. One of the quotes I brought in was by a paper by Carolina Behe and Rachel Daniel. And I think Margaret might have put the link in the chat box, but like those type of resources are really important too, and to share them with students and faculty and making the space.
And I think from just teaching students how to do collaborative research, you do it by example. I don't know that I have to answer Rich's question, I don't know that I have a simple recipe, and I think it's different for everyone, but part of it is sometimes having to deprogram people who are so, high achieving, but because they've been educated in a certain system, it's convincing them to do things somewhat differently. But I think teaching students to do collaborative work is probably one of our most important goals right now, because of the way a lot of science is being done. Even within the science community, the academic community only, but I think, as Jessica said, it's the larger community that needs to be included in these processes. And I think you have to be very careful in that you want to make sure you carve projects out that students can finish in the time that they have, but there are pieces that you can include in that gives them small steps towards moving to being more collaborative. And I think I lost it in my notes, but I had really I wanted to emphasize that, even the things that I have done over the last 25 years, it all started with little steps that then have expanded a bit each time. And again, it all happened fairly slowly. So I think you teach your students to be patient. And sorry, I'll shut up. I'm babbling here.
In kind of a similar vein, Kristen Tim is asking for both of you in your time working here, in what ways has UAF enabled co-production, and where is there low-hanging fruit where small changes in institutional norms can be made to make doing this collaborative research easier?
I don't know about easier. I think it takes a lot of time. I think I've really emphasized that. There is a lot of co-production work being done. I think connecting with those scholars who are doing it and their own process where they're doing it. Because the other thing I've learned just from some of my Indigenous colleagues is that there's so many researchers coming into certain communities, and just it's just kind of leading to research fatigue. So I think just talking amongst each other and understanding opportunities for co-production, or maybe like understanding which communities there's too much research, or maybe there's communities interested in a certain topic, and like I don't have the expertise in that, so I'm going to refer them to Kristen or Uma, those type of things. So like talking amongst each other, which seems really obvious, but it's amazing how we don't do that as much as we could. Like it would be so, like this series is really interesting because you get to share a tiny bit of what you do and share in the chat what others are doing. But wouldn't that be cool if we could do more of that, so we just have somewhat of an idea of what's going on and where there's paths and points of convergence. Yeah, so those are just some of my thoughts.
That's a really good idea. And some of the fatigue, I think, comes not only from researchers in Alaska, it's researchers from outside. And does that give UAF an opportunity to, I don't want to say be gatekeeper, but to facilitate that? So that it, in a sense, protects our Indigenous communities in Alaska, but also helps them get the most out of potential projects that are around the world.
All right, and Amy Topkok asks, what are your thoughts of creating a safe space for Alaska Native students to connect directly with each other, especially if they are in research? Would they find that helpful?
Yeah, and I did reply to her. It is so needed. Dr. Carruthers and I did a teach-in as part of Scholar Strike. And one thing that became really apparent, which wasn't super surprising to me as an Indigenous person that's been in the academic system a long time, but you know, there was a lot of experiences of not so great experiences around racism, not when bringing up Indigenous knowledge or ways of knowing, just kind of being, you know, put to the side, and just some of the hardships they faced while pursuing their education. And I think it is important to have those spaces for them to talk amongst each other, but also to just share how they are viewing what they're learning through their own unique worldview, because we all come to life and our work with our own worldview. And, you know, for some of my students who are English as a second language speakers, you know, they do filter a lot of what they're learning through their language and then translate it to English and then back. And just having spaces for them to think about things, but also garner ideas of ways in which they can share what they know, because you know, they might feel shy, or they want to share something, or they want to go talk to their advisor or their chair and they aren't quite sure how to do that. And so I think those spaces are really important, and to feel supported too, because usually what happens is that you have like one Indigenous student or a couple in a program. Very rarely are there cohorts. So it's good to create those spaces. Now I teach for rural development, and we do have quite a few Indigenous master students, but it's focused on, you know, rural development. So those are just my thoughts.
And yeah, and she follows up, there's a need for one place to look at all the research projects that are being worked on to allow for others to know what is being done. Are there any other places besides UAF departments to be able to see this?
Yeah, I would say my answer to Amy would be, I don't think I've seen, I'm often surprised when I find out that people from elsewhere are doing certain projects in Alaska. So there's a lot going on.
All right. I think we have just a couple minutes. If I didn't, if I missed a question, I'm sorry. If you want to unmute yourself and ask one last one really quick, please feel free to do so, or type it in the chat.
I'll just say, this would have been a nice conversation to have in person, like sitting around a big table, but I'm not complaining. This was great. It was good that we could do it.
All right. All right, guys. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and end our IARC Salon. Again, thank you so much both to our panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to speak with us on this topic, and also for you guys for coming. I totally get it. Finals are finally over for me. It's been a crazy couple of weeks. So with that, please stay tuned for information about our January salon. Nick and I will get that information together and out after the new year. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.